This is Arise America.
A new security force is being launched in Sudan to help protect civilians. It's part of the Juba Agreement and will see 2,000 recruits deployed to Darfur. Sudan has been facing a political crisis since the most recent coup in October. Protests have taken place ever since, with security forces cracking down and detaining political opponents. Well, let's cross live now to the United Nations in New York, where we're joined by Arise International correspondent Faith Orr. Faith, good to see you. The UN Security Council has been meeting, discussing Sudan today. What's the latest on the situation there following last year's coup?
Well, we heard from the Special Representative for Sudan, Volker Perthes. Now, he says that the situation remains precarious with much at stake for Sudan. Efforts are underway by lots of parties to restore the country to a civilian rule. And he says almost everyone has agreed on that, but not everyone. There are some people, he described them as spoilers, who don't want the country on that path. We are still seeing protests quite regularly. They are mostly peaceful now. Of course, we have seen in the past the military violently cracking down on protesters, and one person was killed on Saturday, but on the whole this is reducing. And we know that some of the detainees that the military were holding have been released. 86 people have been freed since late March, but 100 still remain in custody, and the UN wants them to be released. Now, efforts to get people to the negotiating table haven't yet worked, but indirect talks are taking place. They started on May the 12th, and they're focusing on the relationship between the civilians and the military, and also laying the framework for deciding who is going to be the new Prime Minister. There are also calls for women to be heavily involved, at least 40% of the delegations, and that's because they were the driving force behind the revolution that unseated Omar al-Bashir and kicked all of this off.
Now, as we reported earlier, there is a new force that's being launched in Darfur. Can you tell us how that came about?
Darfur has long been an unstable region, but things have been worse since October's coup. We've seen flare-ups of communal violence, particularly bad in April. Now, calm has been restored, but as I say, situation is still precarious there, and there's a real emphasis on providing security for civilians, and that's where this new joint force comes in. 2,000 recruits will complete their training at the end of this month, and they'll be deployed throughout Darfur. Now, importantly, they are being paid the regular army rate that Sudan gives to its other forces, and 80 of them will then be given further training and join the regular forces. UN is also training them on human rights and protecting civilians. But they say that this is just one way to deal with the security. The root cause still needs to be addressed there, and those are land issues as well as the return of refugees and the return of IDPs.
Now, let's discuss humanitarian issues, including food scarcity, big problems. Were these matters addressed in the UN session today?
Yes, so we heard that the price of basic staple foods has increased by 250% from last year. This is because of inflation, a lack of availability of food, and that's of course caused by the war in Ukraine, climate change, a variety of factors. It's expected that by September, 18 million people in Sudan will be in acute hunger. But despite this, the UN Humanitarian Fund has only been funded by 13% for the year. Now, this is because a lot of countries are restricting their funding for Sudan because of the situation there, the political situation. We heard from the UK that have stopped debt relief, for instance, until a government is put in place. But we heard from Sudan, and the representative for Sudan said that, they can't be tied to the political crisis. They need international support, technical and financial, to try and get themselves out of this crisis.
Well, Faith, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for your analysis this evening. Faith Orr, Arise International correspondent at the United Nations in New York.
This is Arise America.